On that gray morning in Rome, something in the air felt different. The windows were partially open, but no breeze entered. The bells of St. Peter's Square rang earlier than usual, and inside a silent room, the most beloved man of faith made one final request. He didn't ask for gold or speeches, didn't ask for crowds, didn't ask for words of comfort. He asked only for a reunion. A simple gesture with a being who doesn't speak, a four-legged friend who had always understood him in silence. And it was in that moment, seconds from the final farewell, that something happened, something that would touch the hearts of those who witnessed it, and which you will now learn about. If stories like this touch your heart, I invite you to subscribe to the channel and leave your like. This helps us continue sharing moments that speak to the soul. Thank you for being here. On that morning in Rome, the sky was opaque. The clouds didn't forecast a storm, but everyone in the Vatican knew something profound was about to happen. There was no commotion or rushing, only the sound of bells resonating a little slower, as if asking for silence. Inside one of the most guarded rooms, lying under light sheets with hands intertwined, rested a man who had guided millions with his voice, but who now preferred silence. The Holy Father was no longer speaking much. His eyes remained closed, not from absence but from contemplation. Around him, doctors, assistants, and religious observers watched with reverence. Every gesture was small, but carried the weight of eternity. It was then, between one prayer and another, that he slowly opened his eyes, looked at a sister who was nearby, and said with a broken yet sacred voice, "Bring Balthazar." The sister froze for a second. The others exchanged confused glances. "Balthazar?" a cardinal asked in a low voice. Was he a priest? A visitor? But the Pope's gaze was clear. There was no doubt. Balthazar was a dog, the faithful four-legged companion who had accompanied him for years. A white, medium-sized dog with a gentle gaze and an immense heart. Balthazar no longer lived in the Vatican since the Holy Father began to fall ill. The animal was taken to Castel Gandolfo under the care of an older sister, Sister Domenica, who fed him, caressed him, and spoke to him with soft words like prayers. But the dog was never the same. He didn't play, didn't eat properly, and slept next to an old cassock. Occasionally, he would howl softly, like one who feels an absence he cannot name. To understand that simple and profound request, it was necessary to go back a long time, long before the Vatican, long before the crowds, the speeches, the white habits. It was necessary to return Argentina, when Jorge Mario was just a boy with rosy cheeks and curious eyes running through the streets of Buenos Aires. The son of humble and deeply religious parents, Jorge grew up hearing a phrase he would never forget. "Jorge, every living being carries the breath of God." With this teaching, he learned to respect ants, birds, cats, and especially dogs. He loved stray dogs, shared his lunch with them, sat on the sidewalk, and caressed those who were afraid of adults. His mother told that once he came home with dirty knees and a puppy in his arms. He was trembling. "I couldn't leave him alone, Mama." As an adult in the seminary, Jorge was known for always feeding the dogs that roamed around the convent, and even as archbishop, he never denied a gesture of kindness to an abandoned animal. Faith and tenderness always walked together in his soul. That's why when he took up the papacy and was called Francis, like the saint who loved all creatures, no one was surprised. And it was also no surprise when one day a light-furred dog appeared in the Vatican's internal garden and inexplicably lay at the Pope's feet as if he already knew him. Francis merely smiled, knelt with effort, and whispered, "Balthazar." Back to the present. The search for Balthazar became urgent. A car was immediately sent to Castel Gandolfo. Inside the vehicle, Sister Domenica held the dog in her arms, caressing his head tenderly. "He knows, my son. He knows," she said softly to the driver. Balthazar, who had not eaten in recent days, was now trembling, but not from fear. His eyes were fixed on the path as if he knew where he was going. Time seemed to be running against everyone. In the Pope's room, vital signs were stable but fragile. His breathing was gentle, almost like a whispered prayer. When the car arrived, Balthazar got out without hesitation. He didn't bark, didn't pull the leash. He just walked as if each step were guided by something greater. The corridors of the Vatican seemed to recognize his little paws. The guards opened the way. The sisters bowed their heads. And then, before the door of the room, Balthazar stopped. No one knew what he would do. No one knew if there was still time. But at that moment, when the door slowly opened, everyone there understood something. The reunion that was about to happen wasn't just between a man and his dog. It was between two souls that had walked side by side, and that perhaps had been created for this purpose. Balthazar walked as if he knew. His step was calm but firm. There was no agitation or fear. The corridors of the Vatican seemed to recognize the sound of his pause. It was as if time had begun to spin at another frequency, slower, more solemn. A dog walking among the Swiss guards with so much dignity that at times it seemed he too wore an invisible cassock. Upon reaching the door, he stopped, not out of fear. He stopped as if asking permission, as if understanding that something sacred was happening inside. Sister Domenica's hands trembled as she touched the doorknob. She looked at one of the guards, who simply made a slight nod of approval, and then the door opened. Inside, everything was silent. Light entered, filtered through a white curtain. The Pope remained lying with his eyes closed, his head slightly tilted to the side. His fingers rested on his chest, and his face exuded peace. Balthazar didn't bark, didn't run. He simply entered, the eyes of those present fixed on that animal. It was as if everyone had forgotten for a moment that there was a dog there. There was something greater, something ancestral, something spiritual. Balthazar approached the bed, stopped beside it, looked at the Pope's face, and sat down. There he remained motionless, ears slightly drooping, eyes fixed on the man he loved so much. It was as if he were waiting for a sign, a word, a sigh, but nothing happened. A nurse discreetly wiped a tear from the corner of her eye. One of the cardinals withdrew in silence, unable to contain his emotion. Everything was so simple and at the same time so profound. Minutes passed, and Balthazar did not move. He was like a sentinel, a guardian of love. Slowly, the Pope moved his fingers, an almost imperceptible gesture, like someone trying to reach something not yet within reach. But he did not open his eyes. Balthazar noticed. He leaned over, lay down beside the bed, and rested his snout on the sheet very close to the Pope's hand. There was still no contact, but the gesture was enough. It was as if, in the invisible world of pure feelings, an embrace had taken place. Sister Domenica withdrew. She knew this wasn't a moment to be witnessed, but to be felt from a distance. Outside, the sun began to hide behind the dome of the basilica. The sky was tinged with a golden orange, while Rome, indifferent to that intimate moment, continued its hurried pace. But inside, time had stopped. Balthazar closed his eyes. The Pope breathed softly, almost imperceptibly. No sound, no words, only the sound of time breathing. It was then that something almost imperceptible happened. The Pope opened his eyes for a brief moment. He said nothing, but his lips moved, and no one there knew for certain what he whispered. Balthazar raised his head, looked at the Pope's face, slightly inclined his body, and approached carefully, as if the fragility of the moment could break with any sudden gesture. But there was no kiss, no contact yet, only proximity, presence, absolute respect. In the adjacent room, the Pope's personal secretary received messages from around the world. Embassies, religious leaders, politicians, faithful, all asking about the pontiff's state of health. But no one knew what was happening at that exact moment. A dog, a room, and a man between earth and heaven. Meanwhile, a persistent memory returned to Balthazar's mind. If dogs really remember as we do, perhaps they remember with their bodies, with their sense of smell, with their souls. He remembered Francis's hurried steps through the garden, the low voice full of pauses, the calloused hands that knew how to bless and caress with the same tenderness. He remembered the afternoons they sat together in the shade of an olive tree, where the Pope simply observed him as one who thanks God for being able to see the beauty of simplicity. And now he was there, steadfast, loyal, present. Time passed. The lights in the room were softened. Balthazar didn't move for hours. He remained there like a four-legged sentinel, like a white-furred angel. And it was thus that night that people began to notice something was happening, that the Pope was no longer responding to calls, that his soul was slowly withdrawing. In the Vatican courtyard, steps echoed emptily. A light breeze made the bells sway at the top of the tower, and some faithful, without knowing exactly why, began to light candles before the image of St. Francis. There was a solemn calm in the air. Inside the room, Balthazar finally lay down beside the bed. There was still no farewell, but the silence was increasingly full of meaning. And so night fell, Francis lying down, Balthazar awake, the world suspended. And what is your opinion about Pope Francis's closest animals? Do you believe he left a good example for humanity? I would love to read your opinion in the comments. The Vatican did not sleep that night. The lights remained on but soft, like invisible candles spread through the corridors. There were careful steps, contained whispers, prayers made with closed eyes and open hearts. It was as if everyone knew, without anyone saying, that a time was ending. In the Pope's room, the atmosphere was one of reverence. Balthazar did not move away from the bed. He had chosen a place on the left side, where his body touched the cold marble floor, but his snout rested on the white sheet. He breathed calmly, as if listening to the rhythm of the heart of the man who gave him his name and shelter. The Pope did not speak. His eyes remained closed. Sometimes there was a slight contraction in his fingers, sometimes a sigh that seemed laden with memories, but it was as if he were already navigating between two worlds, suspended between the now and the eternal. That was no longer a man. It was a presence, a living history reaching its endpoint before becoming eternal memory. Hours earlier, a letter had arrived at the Vatican from the Franciscan community of Assisi, a brief message handwritten. If Francis departs tonight, we know he will be among the birds, the dogs, the trees, and all those he knew how to love with eyes of tenderness. He will be remembered as one who not only spoke of God, but who saw him in every creature. The letter was read in a low voice by one of the assistants, and strangely, Balthazar raised his head at the end of the reading. He remained motionless, as if he understood, as if he had been waiting for those words. In the adjacent room, two religious women prepared an arrangement with olive branches and white flowers. The choice wasn't aesthetic. It was symbolic. The olive branch represented peace and also the promise of life after the flood, the faith that a new beginning would always come. But for the dog, there were no symbolisms, only the absence of sound and the presence of something invisible that he seemed to feel with each hair. Outside, the night sky began to break into blue tones. It was still dawn, but the first timid rays of daybreak pushed the darkness with delicacy. It was as if the world were preparing itself with modesty for what was to come. Balthazar remained lying down. Once he got up slowly, went around the bed, and sniffed the Pope's pillow. Then he returned to his place without noise, without barking. He was the guardian. Meanwhile, in Buenos Aires, where everything had begun, an elderly lady lit a candle before an image of St. Francis. She didn't know exactly why, but she felt something in her chest. "He is leaving," she said simply, and a tear fell unhurriedly. In the room, someone entered. It was a young priest, recently arrived from Latin America, who had personally met the Pope a few months before. He approached slowly, knelt in the corner of the room, and prayed in silence. Balthazar turned his face in the priest's direction and observed him for long seconds. Then he turned his eyes back to the bed. The priest would later write, "I never saw a dog look with such depth. It was as if he already knew what no one could say. And even so, he remained there in silence, waiting." The dawn was advancing. Outside, some faithful began to gather in prayer. A spontaneous chain of faith was forming little by little. Lit candles, rosaries between fingers, words murmured against the wind. There was no official announcement, but love warned beforehand. Inside the room, the Pope's breathing was light, rhythmic. His eyes did not open again, but he still seemed to listen, seemed present though distant. Balthazar got up again, took 2 steps forward, and rested his snout on the Pope's right hand, which rested on his chest. He stayed there quiet. Time seemed to have frozen in that gesture. One of the assistants brought his hand to his mouth, containing a sob, but no one dared to move. At that moment, silence said more than any prayer. It was a silence full, laden with tears that didn't fall, but that burned in the chest. Balthazar lay down for the last time, now closer, with his body pressed against the sheet. He closed his eyes and did not move anymore. Outside, the first rays of sun touched the top of the dome of St. Peter's Basilica. The sky was clear, the breeze gentle, and Rome seemed to stop for a few moments, not knowing that at that exact second, something sacred was about to happen. But this would not be told now. The story of the farewell between a man and his dog, between Francis and Balthazar, didn't happen as seen in movies. It was more real, more silent, and at the same time more indescribable. The sun had already risen when the bells began to toll. It wasn't an alert tone or a hurried call. It was serene, continuous tolling that sounded like a prayer made of bronze. The bells of St. Peter's Basilica announced that time had changed. The Pope's room was calm. Light entered gently through the open curtains, illuminating the white sheet and Francis's serene face. He had departed in peace. There was no agitation, no dramatic last sigh, just a slight loosening of the fingers, a profound silence, and the certainty that there at that moment a soul had returned home. But he did not go alone. Balthazar was there, lying beside the bed, still with his snout touching the fabric, and it was only when the bells began to toll that he got up. No one called him. No one taught him what to do. But the dog took 2 steps to the center of the room, looked around, and then lay down with his body turned toward the window, as if he were keeping watch, as if saying to the world, "I'll stay here until he is at peace." Shortly after, the Pope's body was prepared, dressed with simplicity as he always wanted, and in his hand a small wooden rosary, a gift from an African girl at one of the Vatican audiences. Meanwhile, Balthazar was taken to an internal garden, but he didn't get agitated, didn't cry. He sat looking at the sky. His chest rose and fell slowly, and when someone tried to call him, he simply looked and turned his eyes back to the sky. The world then knew. The news spread like the wind. Pope Francis passes away this morning in the Vatican. Crowds began to form. People cried, prayed, sang. Some brought flowers, others just silence. But there was a profound commotion, something spiritual, inexplicable, as if the world had lost a father or a friend. The news traveled the world like a silent wave of pain and longing. Pope Francis passed away this morning, the headline said. But it wasn't just news, it was an emptiness. That night, St. Peter's Square began to fill up, even without an official announcement. Faithful from all parts of the world began to arrive, as if guided by an inner call that no one could explain. Candles were lit, photos placed, letters left, and among all the images, one began to be repeated spontaneously. St. Francis of Assisi surrounded by animals. It was as if the people were saying, "He is gone, but he left us love for all creation." The cameras focused on hands holding rosaries, teary eyes, slow and respectful gestures. There was no tumult, no despair, there was silence. And amid this silence, Balthazar, the faithful dog who spent the last hours by the Pope's side, remained quiet in one of the internal gardens. He didn't eat, didn't play. He just looked at the sky as if waiting for a sign. Some visitors reported seeing him walk to the iron gates of the Vatican, stop before the crowd, and lie there with his head down, looking at the basilica. Without anyone saying anything, people moved away, made space, and the world seemed to understand. There was no coffin on the altar, but there was a gesture of love, respect, and fidelity. In Buenos Aires, in the neighborhood where Jorge Mario Bergoglio grew up, a lady placed flowers on the sidewalk where he used to play as a child. She murmured, "He always loved dogs, and now one of them stayed to tell the story for us." Newspapers, live broadcasts, social media. Images of Balthazar spread as a symbol of love that transcends words. Balthazar, the friend who stayed until the end, the most moving silence in history, the last gesture of a pope who believed in limitless love. In Manila, Lisbon, Bogota, Rome, Maputo, Santiago, Quebec, people lit candles with photos of Francis and animals. Others held their own pets with more tenderness. That night, the world wasn't just saying goodbye to a pope. It was saying goodbye to a soul that taught with gestures and words that to love is to look at even the smallest with reverence. In the early morning, something curious happened. A white dove, coming from who knows where, landed on the windowsill of the room where Balthazar was sleeping. The dog, who was lying down, slowly raised his head, looked at the bird, then looked at the sky. They stayed like that for a while, motionless, in silence. And a nun who was watching from afar said in a low voice, "I think he understood. I think he knew." The next morning, the photo of the dove and the dog went around the world, and a phrase began to circulate in various languages. Francis's last blessing came in the form of silence and pause. Today, Balthazar lives in seclusion in a convent in the Italian countryside. The sisters say he is calm but very sweet, that he sleeps next to an old cassock, and that sometimes he gets up in the early morning and simply looks at the sky, perhaps waiting for the sound of a voice, perhaps recognizing the presence of one who never abandoned him. Pope Francis left many lessons for humanity. He spoke about compassion, justice, humility. He taught about faith, forgiveness, hope. But one of the most beautiful was this: love for animals, respect for every living being, the understanding that every creature carries the breath of God, and that animals, even without words, love with more purity than many human hearts. This is sacred. Francis demonstrated that no creature is too small not to deserve love, and that a dog can be more faithful than 1,000 speeches, more truthful than 1,000 sermons. He taught us not only with words, but with his heart. If this story moved you, take a deep breath and remember, animals are part of divine creation. They feel, suffer, love, and sometimes see God before we do. Do you believe that animals are creatures blessed by God, that they also have soul, feelings, and the capacity to love unconditionally? I want to know your opinion from wherever in the world you are listening to us. Leave it in the comments. Let's share this message in all corners. Give a like if this story touched your heart, and if you're not subscribed yet, a big hug.